Poetry and Prose is sponsored by the National Endowment for the Arts.
Hi, everyone. I'm Oscar Villalon. I'm the managing editor of ZYZZYVA, a San Francisco literary journal started in 1985. It's my pleasure today to be in conversation with two wonderful authors. With me is Susan Minot. She's an award-winning novelist, short story writer, poet, and screenwriter. Her first novel, Monkeys, won the Prix Femina Étranger in France. Her novel, Evening, was a worldwide bestseller and became a major motion picture. And her additional works include Rapture and 30 Girls. Her new book is the collection, Why I Don't Write. How do you do, Susan?
Hey, nice to see you, Oscar.
And also with us is Karen Russell, won the 2012 and 2018 National Magazine Award for Fiction. And her first novel, Swamplandia, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. She received the MacArthur Fellowship and a Guggenheim Fellowship, the 5 Under 535 Prize from the National Book Foundation, the Bard Fiction Prize, and other acclaim. She is currently holding the endowed chair at Texas State University's MFA program and lives in Portland, Oregon with her husband and her children. I thought it would be helpful to our conversation about the short story form, about the power and the possibilities it contains, to talk about specific stories. To that end, I asked Karen and Susan if they could talk about a favorite story of theirs and the aspects of that piece that make it so outstanding, given how acclaimed both of them are. And I thought it would be especially inspiring to learn from these two powerful practitioners what work impresses them and perhaps informs their own writing. But before we dive in, I want to congratulate both of you on their most recent books. Both collections are thrilling to read, not just because of their themes and narratives, but because of how they are written. And so thank you both for offering us, the readers, such artistry and rejuvenation of the mind.
Thank you, Oscar.
Thank you.
So let's begin. Susan, let's start with you.
So the story that I picked, I think I went back to kind of one of my earliest loves, because there's something so basic about it. But also I return to it again and again, and this story keeps on giving, and I teach it, and it's by Anton Chekhov, our heroic master of the short story, and it's Lady with a Lapdog, which is one of his more famous stories. And the reason I chose it is that often when I teach it, I think people read it and it seems deceptively simple, like it's a story of an affair. A man later in life, he's at a watering hole and he's married, but he's there alone, and he meets a younger woman and they start an affair, and it's not supposed to be anything important to him, and for some reason it kind of seizes control of his heart, really. And that's basically what happens in the story. It's the progress of a man who seems sort of calloused and kind of looks down on women, really, even though, as Chekhov said, he can't live without them, and how that sort of slowly changes. And what Chekhov does so beautifully is he, kind of, instead of going into the details of, for instance, what this young woman looks like, he describes her as Gurov, the protagonist, sees that she's this kind of a person, just describes it that way. So we don't need to know what the lorgnette means and what the clothes she's wearing sort of signify. He just tells us that, but then he goes very much in detail into his initially feeling about women. he's always drawn to them, but then once he's involved, he's bored with them, and you hear very, very straightforwardly about this man, so this psychology of this man, and not really on his side so much, because he doesn't seem to be being heroic and doing the right thing. And yet, because you follow his progress of this, as I say, this opening of his heart, you slowly get taken along to a place that ends up being more surprising. Again, it's all very quiet and but beautifully done.
Karen, before I get to you, I just want to bring something. Hearing you talk about that, Susan, and so much of your work has been described about, talking around the theme of desire. And it's so interesting to hear you then bring up the Chekhov as also this sort of work. Because with your writing as well, I mean, these things are rather subtle. The way you evoke what it is that people want, or sometimes don't have the vocabulary to talk about what they want.
That's right. I mean, I would say, isn't it like one of the first things you learn, like in 5th grade composition? It's like, what does the character want? I remember that as being like, I mean, I relate to that because it's like, yeah, what do people want? What is that? And kind of tracing the sort of development of a desire or a feeling or a change in attitude is fascinating, because that's what the world's going on, but we're each in it, and our experience has to do with what's going on in our brains, what our subjective way of looking at things are. And in this story, you see a man change from looking at things this way, and then suddenly he's looking at things this way. And there's also another quality he has, which I like. And I found this quote from Helen Simpson, the English writer, who was talking about Chekhov and saying, one thing he does is he's king of the short story because he knows when to linger and elaborate and when to keep quiet. So there's this lovely choice there. And then she was talking about many of his stories, and no conclusion is reached, but the story just ends in the air, and yet nothing more needs to be said. So it's this sort of lovely, he's just told you everything you need to know about the situation.
Before I get to Karen, I want you to talk about your story. But Susan, what you just said reminded me of something that I read that Karen said about the short story, that it should somehow leave you with this, I'm paraphrasing, and please correct me, Karen, if I'm wildly off, but it should leave you with the feeling that the story somehow continues without you.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. Yeah. You've been given this slice of a life, really, and by knowing who these characters are, where you leave them, you can sort of get a feeling of where they're going to go on. I do want to say, I mean, you're going to talk to Karen. I hadn't read the story that she picked, but I read it this morning, and it's just fantastic. And I'm going to put it in my syllabus to teach my students. It's just magical.
So without further ado, Karen, please tell us about the story.
Yeah, and I'm so happy that to hear Susan on that story, because I do think, I didn't really read stories in high school. They weren't really taught. We read, canonical novels and wonderful things, 100 Years of Solitude, giant, amazing, Antigone. But for some reason, stories were a real lacuna in my education. And one of the first stories that I got to read as an undergraduate was this Chekhov tale, and that feeling at the ending of being absolutely haunted by the shimmering possibilities and having just enough to go on, right? Just what Susan was saying, the sense that, their troubles are only beginning now. This is really a beginning. And that sort of that panoramic, being drawn to the cliff where you can sort of see the panorama of what life might be for this. It was so exciting to me not to have something closed down, to that sort of the baton pass of where a story writer leaves the reader is always fascinating to me. And I think that Susan is like the queen of the dismount. And they're always the most surprising endings and the most thrilling. I read it the way, I heard another writer saying it's almost like the Olympics, you can see all these wonderful tricks in the air and you're just, what are they going to stick the landing? And it's like with that kind of satisfaction, and productive frustration sometimes because you want to follow these people too. But it is that I love that about the story. It's like you've been given this with this generous severity. Someone has given you like a porthole to look through, and you get the privilege of being with these people for a little time, and then you get to know the ocean that they're swimming in. And if the story works, I think you carry that with you. And Islands was like that for me. And I picked this story. I get a little shy talking about it because I love it so much. I don't know if that happens to you, Susan. There's some stories I can't teach. I'm like this belligerent person. Like if someone, I just want people to love it the way I do, which isn't really good teaching,
And the author?
This is Alexander Heyman, and this is from his first collection, The Question of Bruno. He's a writer from the former Yugoslavia. He came here, and he wrote this story. English is not his first language. He's like Nabokov. He's this freaky genius person. And the whole collection is brilliant. And one of the things I first loved about it, you talked about, Oscar, in your introduction, rejuvenating the mind. Something about reading, in this story in particular, there's so much play with language. It's also, it's a retrospective tale from the point of view of a young boy on a vacation to the island of Millet off the coast of southern Dalmatia. And I'll just read the opening, if that's okay, to give people a sense of the flavor of it, because I'm not sure this isn't maybe as well known as Chekhov. It should be, maybe. We got up at dawn, ignored the yolky sun, loaded our navy blue Austin with suitcases, and then drove straight to the coast, stopping only on the verge of Sarajevo so I could pee. I sang communist songs the entire journey, songs about mournful mothers looking through graves for their dead sons, songs about the revolution steaming and steely like a locomotive, songs about striking miners burying their dead comrades. By the time we got to the coast, I had almost lost my voice. So that's the beginning. And then I promise this isn't a spoiler because you'll go on this journey. It's told in 33 sections. And sort of like Susan, in paraphrase, not much happens. He goes to this island. He sees apiaries. He sees old convents. He encounters, with a sort of the humid embrace of these relations that when you're a kid, they're like, go kiss your Aunt Ludmilla. And you're like, who the hell is that? Okay. It's the world of childhood. It's so immersive. And I think what was instructive to me, I have a real, especially as a young student of writing, that balance of telling and showing. I mean, the way that he's processing this new place and the way that stories are affecting him, the way that language is falling into him. He's under this waterfalling current of the adults. None of them think that a 9-year-old child understands what he's hearing, but his uncle is telling stories about other children being killed in these camps, in Stalin's camps in the 40s. He's telling stories about predation, terrible abuse. And the way that you hear as a kid with like your eyes that are all pupil, and people say, oh, children are so resilient. Look at little, Billy's just playing on the rug. Of course, you're absorbing all of this ordnance. And so part of the action of the story is just watching history tumble into a child and understanding that this is going to affect him irrevocably for the rest of his life. And simultaneously, he's just walking around the island, looking at mongooses and snakes, looking at sort of the violence in the natural world. And that becomes a mirror of the action of these, human, these terrible cycles of history that he's hearing without total comprehension. But obviously, in the language of childhood, he's working them out. So at the end of the story, that's it. That's all that happens. He sees these relatives. He hears some terrible stories about these concentration camps, and he goes home. It took us only 4 hours to get home from the coast, and I slept all the time, oblivious to the heat, until we reached Sarajevo. When we got home, the shriveled plants and flowers were in the midst of the setting sun orange spill. All the plants had withered because the neighbor who was supposed to water them had died of a sudden heart attack. Pat, having not been fed for more than a week, was emaciated and nearly mad with hunger. I would call to her, but she wouldn't come to me. She would just look at me with irreversible hatred. Every time I read that, I want to cry. And I've always felt that way about this story. And that's the other thing I wanted to say is just why you love a story is so mysterious. And this is why I can't teach it, because some students are like, sort of blasé about it. And I'm like, who could be indifferent to this masterpiece? But something about
can I say
in perspective that Susan was talking about, right? How do you communicate that and let it reverberate inside someone? You leave your home on a vacation, you're singing these songs, you come home and something has changed ineluctably, and you're just at the beginning of understanding what that change is going to mean. But it's irreversible, So sorry, I didn't.
Susan, you were going to say something? No, Karen. No, thank you for that. That's
I was just
lovely.
I was just going to add one thing about the reason why I do want to teach this after having read it 2 hours ago is that I think when you're talking about the way this boy, he's 9 years old, and the way he's processing things, it's like he's hearing about the death camps, but he's also, fascinated with the bees that land and the way that the bread is set out in the morning like dominoes on a mirrored plate. I mean, it is so.
Yeah. He can still see. I mean, he can really see, and he's paying attention to what the adults are just totally missing, right? On that.
Well, because everything is new. Yeah.
There's one detail, sort of like he pushes his thumb in his arm and he watches the ghost imprint. The way that kids live in time, it's like incredible to have that restored to you.
And the way you are both speaking about this story and the Chekhov, I just want to stress to the folks seeing this, you speak with as much enthusiasm and with as much elation as one would of a novel.
Oh,
and
more.
how more so, Karen? Well, let's talk about. Let's talk about that power of a story.
Yeah.
Of what this form does.
I will tell you something too. I went to Minot on my honeymoon. This was where I wanted to go because that's the impact that this story has had on me all these many years. Also, we got a great deal. I mean, it was the off season in Croatia. I recommend it. It was all there. The apiary, the dot on the map. But it's, I think there's a way where you can read a story. I've probably read this story 100 times. It's almost as if you wrote it, or it's like a memory returning to your body. And novels, the best novels, the ones I love the best, many years later, I'm like, that lady on the train tracks. I think it just lives. I speak for myself. But I think because of their brevity, they have a power that is like a music or a poem. It's like a little spell you can carry around to cast on yourself. And you can walk the periphery of it. You can read it in a single sitting. So the impact on you, it feels different to me. It can be so sharp too. It can really hurt you in a way that I don't always feel hurt by novels. I bet Susan has a better answer.
Well, no, I think what you were saying about being able to carry it, like stories, you can reflect on them kind of whole in a way, whereas a novel goes off and here and there, and while you're reading it, you can immerse yourself in it, and the experience maybe is more like a submersion in the ocean. But a short story is like a jewel that you can keep always. It's not as experiential in the final thing you take away with it. I mean, I think it was Borges said, why write something longer when you can say it just as well shorter?
It was distilled form. Yeah.
I mean, that's why stories are definitely my favorite form. And everyone is it America? It's like if it's longer, it's bigger, it's better, it's a novel. I don't ascribe to that at all.
What do you think of the idea too? There's something about the short story that maybe more so than a novel accentuates the possibility of how vast life is. I'll give you an example. When I was 15, I really, really loved Ray Bradbury. And I remember, I think, around that time, that first giant collection came out of all his stories. And I would, at lunch in high school, I would just go to the library and just read this thing, just devour it. And part of the reason why I loved it so much is because, in accretion, all these themes were pointing to ways of seeing the world, ways of being, possibilities, and they stoke something in you.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in those stories in particular, it's like his imagination is so super powered. And I continue to love him so much, and I learn from him. I think those stories are often taught to middle grade readers, and
Mhm.
um, there's amazing allegory for the frontier and all the violence of the frontier, and you just can see it differently from this estranged perspective of Mars. And there's such a melancholy inside them too that I think I probably missed as a child. But going back to some of these quiet domestic tales of despair, they just happen to be set in an alien living room in Mars. And there is a way that I think with a story collection also, it's like an archipelago. You can there's a way where you can live 100 lives in an afternoon. That's different. Maybe different points of view. Different continents, different bodies.
Let me ask you: does a story allow a writer, just multiple ways of just exploring a theme in a way perhaps a novel doesn't?
Well, I think Susan should take this
Hmm.
one. I definitely feel that so strongly.
I think what a novel allows is you can branch off. You don't have to kind of really stick to a certain track, because just the length of the short story usually says we're going to be sticking to a certain track here. Whereas in a novel, you could go off track on short stories too, but it's something about really sticking to, you can even create the theme. It may not seem like this is the theme, but if it's in a short story, it's all going to reflect on each other, and it's going to have to be about that. A novel is like, it's like you can take deeper breaths. You don't have to be as careful. And the care in a short story is what's so satisfying. It's like you're getting razor cut thing. That's why I keep on thinking of the jewel analogy. It's like that
Mhm.
more than, planting a garden. It's like one flower that we're just going to look at.
And there's so much more pressure on the language, and that's what I really love
Mm.
about the stories in Susan's new book. You sense this intelligence selecting and refining, and there's stories in there that they work on me the way poems do, because it's so deeply interesting, surprising, just the friction that one word has next to another, or the valence of one word. I mean, you feel this incredible intelligence sort of ordering the world for you. And I don't always feel that in a novel. So you have to have some workmanlike language, or it's,
Mhm.
there's a little more permission to be digressive, or, you moving the furniture around. I don't know. But I don't really
No,
know.
I
I've
agree.
only read one novel. So I always feel like if you were like made one omelet and called yourself a chef. So, it's not really.
Well, actually, Karen, if you're working the brunch buffet, yes, you could. I think, but I
I think
couldn't agree
even
more. In fact,
sorry, I
no,
was just
no,
going to say,
no,
even
no.
the
Go
way
ahead. Yes, please.
I think of a novel is made up of little short stories.
Mm.
Right, well,
I mean,
monkeys, right? Monkeys is so.
they're all being put together to tell something that maybe takes place over a longer period of time, or it includes
Right.
more character, something. But I still, either whether it's a chapter, whether it's just a scene, I still try to sort of approach it like a short story. Like I want this to be as much as I need to know for this scene. Like you're not going to find it out later. It's going to be everything you need to know
Mhm.
here, and then we'll go on to the next thing, like Little Islands. Yeah.
Mhm.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think, having read both of your collections, um, again, and this is, one, they're both wonderful, as I said before, but two, the possibilities in narrative of one could do in short fiction. With Susan, and I guess I'll try to be as articulate as I can here. How interiority can become a narrative, and Karen, with yours, how what we could call the fantastical in itself. With the epic in 20 pages. The entire lives felt and lived in a dozen or so pages. World building, etc. These sort of things. It's so exciting. I have to say, as a reader, I take such great pleasure in story collections and finding stories. Obviously, I work at a literary journal. This is much of what we do. But I also wanted to point that out that stylistically, it's so malleable.
It's so malleable, and I love what you said, Oscar, about the mystery of time. Sometimes I think people still think of a short story as a chronological. You set the timer and you stop it, sort of like a sprinter's lunge, and it can be that, right? There is sort of a violence almost to how little a world presents itself, and then the story is concluded. But in Susan's work, I was just so struck, particularly in this new collection, at how haunted these stories are by time, and the scale of a life can occur in a deathbed conversation, in these slim pages, and but you feel the whole gravity of a life.
I've got more time behind me now, Karen.
But I thought it's such a magic trick to feel that distillation of, and just the way that a life continues to be haunted by all these latent possibilities in the past, right? Not just the future. I think it's so in sentences, just putting words in a row, and you're sort of bound to grammar, which is kind of a freight train, and to find a way to get that magic of how absolutely haunted every moment feels by the past is a magic the story can do, I think.
Since you're talking about my story, I want to talk about one of your stories, which just blows me away. That was a really, really bad pun, called The Tornado Auction.
Oh, I do like
which is this amazing story about a kind of farmer, but who used to breed storms. Like, this is something someone can do, breed tornadoes like wild horses or something, and it ends up being, besides this sort of wonderful, sort of imaginative, like, imagine if you could breed storms, like, what would that be like? It's such an incredible, touching metaphor for, like, a father and family life, and how one's failings hurt people, and it doesn't just stay in this fantastical world, which in and of itself would be enough. It goes into this incredible psychological penetration. It just blows my mind, that story.
Oh, I'm so glad you like that story, Susan. It's funny, I was just thinking about, especially watching, I have a 3-year-old too, and he lives his whole day telling up, and it's not that much more sophisticated, right? He's like, what would happen if? Yeah, you could. I think his stories are much more interesting than any of my what ifs right now. But I almost think sometimes the stories that I'm happiest with, it's like you almost have to disarm and charm yourself in some way, or distract. I feel like I have to distract myself sometimes with, like, a weird pyrotechnic, like, can I make a storm live on the page? And then the other stuff is always a surprise to me. And I'm so happy when the story eludes my own, conscious ambition for it and becomes something else. That's a lot of the joy of writing for me, is that kind of discovery. And I feel that very much in your work too, Susan. I think that the language encodes that moment of surprise. You sort of can't fake it, right? It's something surfaces to meet your gaze, and thank goodness.
And I think I would add, I think the reader senses that as well.
I do think, and I feel that was a really slow lesson for me. Sometimes I would hammer away at something, that I wanted to impress people, or, I had different motivations. And usually that, right, some kind of self-conscious, or what I should be writing, what I thought I should be interested in. And those stories are just, a plane sitting on the tarmac without an engine. I mean, they really go nowhere. And it was a belated epiphany for me to think, if I'm not interested, why would I ever expect a reader to care about this? Like, that seems foredoomed. Like, if I.
Well, I was going to say, Susan and Karen, thank you so much. This has been very lovely. And again, congratulations to both of you on your most recent books. If people haven't got the hint yet, they're very good. Please do yourself a favor and read them.